Nancy Kissel had once appeared to possess every marker of a successful life. She was well educated, financially comfortable, and deeply involved in her roles as both a mother and a spouse to a high-flying investment banker. Yet beneath the carefully managed exterior lay a reservoir of emotional turbulence and psychological strain. Her persona, friendly and eager to please, seemed to collide with stresses that often simmer in the tightly wound worlds of corporate finance and expatriate life. And later, it was down until she, as an individual, seemed to collide with stresses that often simmer in the tightly wound worlds of corporate finance and expatriate life, that exhibited a calm, patient veneer. But accounts from those who knew her suggest there were rumblings of discontent and distress long before the night that would unravel both her family and her future. In the stifling humidity of Hong Kong's frenetic pace, Nancy had tried to cultivate a semblance of suburban peace in the plush apartment complex known as Parkview. She socialized with other expatriate wives, attended community events, and ensured her children were enrolled in respected schools. In everyday conversation, she projected the image of a woman who carefully balanced the demands of home life with the social obligations that came with her husband's profession. But behind closed doors, small cracks appeared. She occasionally confided in close friends about mounting problems in her marriage. On more than one occasion, people saw her shift from smiling hostess to tense figure lost in thought. That tension intensified in the months leading up to November 2003. The couple's arguments grew more frequent, the stakes were higher. Robert Kissel's considerable success in the financial realm had brought both opportunity and, ironically, isolation. Each new pay raise or promotion seemed to ramp up pressure on the entire family, confining them within the golden cage of executive life in Hong Kong. Nancy began speaking of heartbreak and betrayal and of not being heard. Though she never came across as physically volatile, there was a look in her eyes, a kind of distant resignation, or, at times, simmering frustration, that close observers found disconcerting. Even as friends noticed these subtle changes, few could have predicted the profound disruption soon to come. What transpired on that fateful November night would not only shatter the Kissel family, but also become one of Hong Kong's most talked about murder cases. The city would learn that sometimes the gentlest smile can hide the darkest intentions, and that the outer trappings of success can belie an interior world on the brink of collapse. In the aftermath, many would struggle to reconcile the Nancy they thought they knew with the woman who stood accused of ending the life of her own husband. Robert Kissel was, at first glance, every bit the archetype of the American expat success story. Born in the late 1960s, he spent his youth in New Jersey, nurtured by parents who encouraged both intellectual curiosity and a strong work ethic. By the time he reached high school, Robert's keen interest in economics and mathematics began to shine. He devoured articles on market trends, studied business magazines cover to cover, and participated in academic clubs that sharpened his analytical mind. His ambition led him to a reputable university where he majored in finance, all the while building the foundation that would launch him onto the global stage of investment banking. On graduation, Robert wasted little time establishing himself in the competitive financial sector. He started on Wall Street, taking on a junior analyst role with a prominent investment bank. Known for his diligence, he quickly earned praise for his methodical approach to research. By his late 20s, Robert had become a dependable figure in fast-pacing trading rooms. A promotion was always within reach, and he tackled each new role with a characteristic blend of humility and confidence. His inclination to mentor new hires and share industry insights set him apart from the stereotypical cutthroat banker image. Many who worked with him later recalled that while he was fiercely intelligent, he was also remarkably courteous, never forgetting a colleague's birthday or a small personal detail they had once mentioned. It was in this early phase of his career that he met Nancy, a woman whose lively warmth contrasted with his more reserved demeanor. Their courtship was understated but genuine, built on nights at the theater and conversations about travel, family, and hopes for the future. Several years into their relationship, Robert faced a crossroads when an opportunity arose to relocate abroad for a major investment bank. The prospect of working in Hong Kong's booming financial markets was an opportunity he considered too valuable to pass up. Nancy, eager for adventure and supportive of his ambitions, agreed to move. They married, certain that the strong foundation of their bond would endure the unfamiliar terrain awaiting them in Asia. By the early 2000s, Robert had ascended to a senior position at Merrill Lynch in Hong Kong. His professional world was a flurry of conference calls, investment strategies, and portfolio analyses. Despite the pressure, he continued to impress superiors, surpass revenue goals, and forging alliances in the region's intricate financial circuits. He also took pride in ensuring his family's comfort. A generous compensation package allowed them to settle in the prestigious Parkview apartment complex, nestled in the scenic hills above the city. With top-tier schools, a safe environment, and a high staff of social circle, it seemed like the ideal place to raise their 3 children. Robert's connections within that expat community were extensive. Parents at the Children's International School spoke highly of him, acknowledging his willingness to volunteer for school events and donate to fundraisers. He joined local clubs that blended work and leisure, forging networks that included real estate developers, investment consultants, and philanthropic organizers. While he was not the most gregarious guest at social gatherings, his earnest conversation and quiet wit made him a respected figure among peers. In the final months of his life, however, signs of strain began to emerge around the edges. Reports from friends suggest Robert was wrestling with both personal and professional challenges. While details remained disputed, murmurs of marital discord circulated. Some said the couple seemed distant at social events. Others noticed Robert fielding private phone calls at odd hours, his expression growing pained once he hung up. Business associates observed that Robert, typically the polished professional, occasionally seemed distracted during meetings. Yet he soldiered on, setting up new deals, preparing for upcoming business trips, and trying to ensure his children's routine remained unaffected. The last few days before November 2003 would be telling. Robert had reportedly discovered unsettling information about Nancy, possibly financial irregularities, possibly emotional betrayals. He confided in a close colleague that something in his marriage was seriously off. More importantly, he appeared determined to address the matter head on. On the afternoon before his death, he was seen in the building's corridors with an air of grim resolution, as though steeling himself for a difficult confrontation. No one, not even those close to Robert, fully grasped the depth of whatever crisis he was about to face. To outsiders, his life seemed an enviable mosaic of professional triumph and personal stability. That he would wind up a homicide victim in his own home defied the entire narrative of success he had carefully built. Within a single day, the image of a man who had it all, thriving career, beautiful family, upscale living, shifted tragically to that of a casualty in a harrowing domestic drama. For those who knew and loved him, the shock would reverberate for years to come, a heartbreaking reminder of the complexities hidden behind even the most polished facades. So the last letter says it goes downhill after 6 months, which is rapid fire. And this is when I actually felt something deeper. Yeah, I think we can all relate to that. Nancy was born and raised in a middle-class suburb in the Midwest. Throughout her youth, she radiated an easy charm that drew people into her orbit. Friends recall that she displayed an artistic streak, dabbling in interior design and showing a flair for creative projects. She pursued a degree in communications, earning decent grades without ever becoming overly academic. She seemed more interested in forging connections and exploring new experiences, confiding to her college roommate that she wanted to see the world and one day raise a family under better financial circumstances than she'd had growing up. When Nancy met Robert, a self-assured finance professional already on track for a successful career, it felt like a dream realized. She found him pragmatic, ambitious, and quietly protective, qualities that both complemented and grounded her more free-spirited personality. Their wedding was a modest affair, overshadowed by the promise of a bright international future. Embarking on a life in Hong Kong seemed thrilling to Nancy, and she envisioned herself as a global citizen, immersing in a bustling metropolis. For a time, it worked. She threw herself into making the Parkview apartment a true home, complete with carefully chosen decor that reflected her penchant for style. Yet as the family settled into the expatriate enclave, the pressures of Robert's demanding job and the staccato rhythms of raising three young children began taking their toll. Nancy's days filled up with school runs, household logistics, and social events with other expatriate wives, teas, luncheons, and philanthropic galas. From the outside, it seemed she had constructed an enviable routine, one that even came with household help. But Nancy's own internal narrative grew complicated. She felt lonely during Robert's long office hours, stifled by the constant undercurrent that she should project the image of the perfect executive spouse. She shared with a close friend her mixed emotions of gratitude and frustration. Gratitude for material comforts, frustration at feeling overlooked. Over time, these feelings hardened. A psychological evaluation presented in court documents would later describe Nancy as capable of deep affection but prone to episodes of depression and anxiety. She was said to be hypervigilant about perceived threats or slights, sometimes nursing small grievances until they curdled into resentment. Indeed, she began to see herself not just as a neglected wife, but as a trapped one. Was a trapped one? Reports suggest she believed Robert had grown dismissive of her opinions, focusing on his deals and ignoring her needs. Late at night, neighbors occasionally heard muffled arguments. Nancy's sense of disillusionment seemed to feed on itself, magnifying every marital dispute into a reflection of a deeper, insoluble problem. In the social domain, Nancy's standing began to waver. While her peers described her as friendly, a few noted she sometimes engaged in conversations that hinted at hidden emotional depths or secret struggles. Rumors circulated that she was unhappy enough to consider leaving Hong Kong entirely. Nonetheless, she kept appearances polished, planning playdates, attending parties, and sharing anecdotes about the children. Those with a discerning eye, however, noticed her forced smiles and absent stares. In the months before the murder, Nancy's emotional state, as she later claimed, descended into desperation. She mentioned feeling cornered, allegedly suspecting Robert of having an affair. Tensions escalated to a point where, according to her, even day-to-day interactions felt threatening. The pivot from this emotional turbulence to homicidal plans remains one of the case's most disturbing elements. This is very interesting to me because did she have a breaking point? Or was the act premeditated? Psychologists reviewing her behaviors at trial debated the roots of her rage. Whatever the ultimate truth, Nancy's transformation from struggling spouse to alleged poisoner reveals a chilling progression. People around her recalled her subdued demeanor in late October 2003. She was often quiet, lost in thought, occasionally seen making phone calls in corners during parties, as though orchestrating something too weighty to share. In hindsight, many would point to these signs as red flags they wished they had recognized. Yet few could imagine she was on the cusp of a deed so final, so inexorable, that it would shock even a city long accustomed to sensational headlines. The days leading up to November 2003 passed uneventfully on the surface, but behind that facade, a storm was brewing. Friends of the couple sometimes saw them exchanging tense glances at social gatherings. Parkview's meticulously groomed hallways provided no real refuge from the intensifying arguments that ricocheted between the couple behind closed doors. In the lead-up, Nancy was noted to have made multiple phone calls to an acquaintance in the United States, fueling speculation that she was confiding in someone far removed from the Hong Kong social circle. Meanwhile, Robert dove deeper into his work and discreetly confided in a colleague. On the Friday before the murder, that colleague recollected Robert describing a catastrophic problem at home, though he stopped short of detailing what it was. Um, that final weekend was dominated by the threat of an oncoming typhoon, an ominous metaphor for the tension in the Kissel household. While the actual weather system curved away from the city, a figurative storm broke out in the Kissel's apartment. Nancy and Robert argued late into the night on Saturday, raising their voices in a way that was audible through the walls. One neighbor, returning from a late function, heard Robert shout something about betrayal. Another witness described hearing Nancy weep, her voice trembling with either sorrow or dread. Oh. Within the Kissel residence, that sorrow and dread were morphing into something else entirely. Nancy's anxiety had allegedly reached a fever pitch. She later claimed she feared for her safety, though evidence would challenge the credibility of that claim. She began preparing a mixture of crushed sedatives, various sleep aids, and anti-anxiety medications. Sedatives like angel root. Investigators found evidence that she had done so surreptitiously, removing pills from prescription bottles and grinding them into a fine powder that could be concealed. Around the same time, she also procured a large quantity of a pink sweetened milkshake mix, a detail that would become a grim hallmark of the case. What truly triggered the final confrontation remains a subject of debate. Some theorize that an argument erupted over infidelity accusations, with Nancy accusing Robert of having an affair. Others suggest Robert was confronting Nancy over her own indiscretions or questionable financial decisions. Regardless, the tension crescendoed in the hours just before midnight on November 1. Nancy retreated to the kitchen, mixing the milkshake, stirring in the powdered medication. She would later contend that this was meant to sedate Robert, not kill him, claiming she was desperate for respite from his alleged anger. Robert, exhausted from the prolonged argument, accepted the drink. Precisely how much he knew or suspected remains unclear. Nancy's story is that she presented it as a peace offering, a gesture to help them both calm down and rest. Whether Robert sipped it unsuspectingly or felt something was off is impossible to know. The forensic evidence would later indicate that the concentration of sedatives in the drink was high, enough to subdue any adult male quite swiftly. What followed was the pivotal moment. With Robert incapacitated, Nancy used a heavy object to strike him repeatedly. This, at least, is the version the prosecution would assert at trial. Nancy's own account evolved, initially suggesting that she acted in self-defense, frightened by an enraged husband. However, photographic evidence of the bedroom showed minimal signs of a struggle, reinforcing the notion that Robert was already unconscious when he was attacked. And the method was as brutal as it was unexpected. The image of a battered body in a plush expatriate household stood in stark contrast to the glamorous facade of wealth and stability. In the immediate aftermath, Nancy's actions became even more confounding. She wrapped Robert's body in a large carpet and attempted to drag it out of the bedroom. The weight and size of the roll made this a physically daunting task. Security footage from the building's corridor captured a brief but haunting moment. Nancy struggling to maneuver something unwieldy on a trolley, eyes scanning the hallway. Once the body was concealed, Nancy apparently set about cleaning the bedroom, an effort that was only partially successful, as forensic technicians later recovered considerable amounts of blood spatter in hidden areas. Yeah, the method suggested a mixture of desperation and planning. The sedative-laced milkshake pointed to premeditation, as did the arrangement of the carpet. Yet the frantic attempts at cleanup spoke to a lack of clarity in the aftermath, as though Nancy had grossly underestimated the magnitude of her actions. Neighbors reported seeing her in the elevator the next morning, looking pale and shaken, as though she'd barely slept. She told one neighbor she wasn't feeling well and needed to pick up medicine. What Nancy did next can only be described as a calculated yet unraveling attempt at a cover-up. She kept the children away from the bedroom and avoided letting them see their father's body. She made phone calls to family in the United States, but what she told them remains unclear. Later, a few close friends received perplexing messages indicating that Robert had traveled on business unexpectedly. Those messages lacked clarity, and some found it odd that Robert would depart on such short notice. Rumors soon percolated, but no one was prepared for the horrifying revelation that was about to come. Nancy's actions did not go unnoticed for long. Security staff at Park View were alerted to a foul odor emanating from a storage area. As the building employees investigated, they made the chilling discovery: a large blood-stained carpet, inside which they found Robert's body. Emergency services were called, the police arrived, and an unprecedented drama began to play out in one of Hong Kong's most exclusive residential communities. Within hours, Nancy Kissel was in custody. Her initial claims of ignorance contradicting the evidence police had already gathered. That first day after the crime, Nancy, in a seeming daze, answered questions haltingly. She would later assert that she had been the victim of domestic abuse and that she acted in self-defense. Yet her calm exterior and the nature of the evidence didn't seem to support that narrative. Investigators found half-empty vials of crushed sedatives in the kitchen, the suspicious milkshake residues, and signs of a violent assault in the bedroom. Crime scene was a forensics puzzle, but one that soon yielded answers that no self-defense explanation could easily counter. We've been talking a lot about Together as one of the best documentaries. In the hours and days following the discovery of Robert's body, Nancy's behavior seemed erratic. At certain points, she appeared grief-stricken and frantic. At others, she was icy and detached. Detectives noted her conflicting statements and the shifting details of her story. The seeds of the prosecution's argument that this was a premeditated murder, not a spontaneous act, were planted almost immediately. So, by the end of the week, the local media were swirling with speculation. Headlines about the Milkshake murder dominated front pages, catapulting the case into a citywide fixation. The Hong Kong police force's initial response to the discovery was as swift as it was methodical. Law enforcement officials recognized from the outset that this was far from an ordinary homicide. The location, a luxury high-rise catering to affluent expatriates, incentivized instant media interest. Word spread quickly among residents, and soon the press arrived, cameras flashing, hungry for any detail of this grim unraveling. The police, keenly aware that they were dealing with potential public scrutiny from international outlets, sealed off the area around the Kissel's apartment to preserve evidence. Teams of investigators in white coveralls photographed every inch of the crime scene, carefully cataloging items for potential forensic clues. Within the crucial first 48 hours, lead detectives focused on interviewing Nancy. She was brought in for questioning and placed under close watch, given the risk that she might flee or attempt to contact someone to aid a cover-up. Her explanations shifted. First, she suggested it was an accident. Then she insisted Robert had threatened her life. Investigators found these inconsistent narratives deeply problematic. Forensic specialists were simultaneously scrutinizing the battered state of Robert's remains, concluding early on that the savage nature of the injuries contradicted a scenario of simple self-defense. Nancy was formally arrested and charged with murder, a move that set the stage for one of Hong Kong's most scrutinized investigations in recent memory. Early in the investigation, detectives uncovered an abundance of physical evidence pointing toward premeditation. The remnants of sedative-laced milkshake in the kitchen sink, the discovery of multiple prescription medications in Nancy's personal effects, the suspiciously timed phone calls to the United States. Each piece fit a puzzle that suggested she had carefully orchestrated the fatal encounter. The presence of blood spatter in the bedroom indicated Robert had been struck multiple times while incapacitated. Police also found Nancy's attempts to clean up. Those incomplete efforts at concealment only underscored the brutality of the act and the lack of any serious effort to claim she'd been overpowered. Mm. Technical experts conducted thorough forensic examinations. The blood evidence told a story of a victim who was likely lying down when the assault began. Lab analysts found trace amounts of sedation in Robert's bloodstream at levels consistent with unconsciousness. They retrieved chemical traces from the blender used to prepare the milkshake, detecting the presence of multiple benzodiazepines. The bedroom's walls, curtains, and even the underside of furniture tested positive for blood spatter. Specialists used advanced trajectory modeling to map the angles of impact, building a horrifyingly clear picture of how the blows were delivered. Later, documents from the forensic laboratory were presented in court, showing that the sedation dosage was potent enough to fell a robust adult male within minutes. And while investigators continued to gather evidence, the case grew more complex. Nancy began cooperating selectively, but her cooperation often came with contradictory details that further undermined her credibility. At times, she made allegations of domestic abuse that the police could not substantiate through medical records, neighbor testimony, or any direct evidence. Furthermore, no prior complaints or restraining orders existed, raising skepticism about her claims. Still, law enforcement remained methodical. They seized Nancy's computer, scoured her phone records, and interviewed her friends. They also reviewed Robert's digital footprint, including emails he had sent in the weeks leading up to his murder. The public followed each revelation with intense curiosity. Media outlets in Hong Kong splashed sensational headlines about a milkshake murder, playing on the grotesque incongruity of a sweet beverage as a murder weapon. Satellite TV stations from abroad picked up the story, adding another layer of scrutiny. End of letter 1G10. Secrets, classified, compiled. Sentence sum. As the investigation took shape, the Hong Kong police worked in tandem with U.S. authorities to verify Nancy's background, her prescription history, and the suspicious transactions in her bank accounts. Reports surfaced that Nancy had considered leaving Robert and fleeing with the children to the United States, fueling suspicions that her motive might have been both emotional and financial. Within the first few months, the volume of evidence seemed insurmountable. Detectives pieced together a detailed timeline showing Nancy's procurement of sedatives, her purchase of the pink milkshake mix, and the final confrontation. Witness statements, forensic science, and phone records coalesced into a near-complete narrative. Nancy had orchestrated a plan to incapacitate Robert, then assaulted him while he lay helpless. Investigators emphasized that this was not a case of spontaneous rage, but rather a methodical, if ultimately clumsy, plan. Despite the mounting evidence, Nancy's defense lawyers, anticipating a complex legal battle, seized upon her allegations of abuse. They also pointed to her psychological profile, suggesting she may have been suffering from diminished responsibility. This defense stance set the stage for a trial that would become an extended exercise in dissecting Nancy's state of mind, her version of events, and the contradictory evidence at the crime scene. The prosecution, in turn, prepared for a rigorous challenge, armed with the scientific analyses that painted a chillingly deliberate act. As 2004 progressed, the case advanced through the pre-trial phase in Hong Kong's legal system. Nancy was officially charged with murder, and bail was denied due to the severity of the crime and the perceived flight risk. The prosecution prepared a robust case file, including witness statements from Parkview staff and neighbors, forensic reports detailing the presence of sedatives, and security footage of Nancy transporting the rolled-up carpet. Meanwhile, her defense team filed motions to suppress certain pieces of evidence, arguing that some aspects of the investigation might have been mishandled. However, the court generally ruled in favor of admitting the evidence, given its clear chain of custody and the professional conduct of the police during the search and seizure process. The legal proceedings that followed were a spectacle, with local and international media fixated on every detail. Court hearings prior to the trial introduced the public to the central arguments. The prosecution contended Nancy had planned to kill Robert, citing her accumulation of sedatives and her attempts to hide the body as unambiguous evidence of intent. The defense countered with a narrative of an abused wife, painting Robert as a controlling and at times threatening figure. They argued Nancy had acted out of fear for her life, or at least in a moment of temporary insanity brought on by traumatic stress. When the trial finally began, courtrooms were packed, journalists lined up early for seats, and cable news programs provided near-daily updates. The prosecution's case was stark and straightforward, meticulously presented forensic evidence, medical expert testimony about Robert's injuries, and a timeline that placed Nancy at the center of it all. They bolstered their position with digital evidence, showing that Nancy had researched sedative dosages online. One of the more dramatic moments occurred when a forensic pathologist described in clinical detail how Robert likely lay helpless as the fatal blows rained down. The jury listened in rapt silence, confronted with the brutality of the act. Um, mhm. Nancy's defense strategy centered on shifting the lens toward her emotional and psychological state. Her lawyers tried to expose what they characterized as a long history of verbal and physical abuse at Robert's hands, though concrete documentation was scant. They introduced a mental health expert who testified that Nancy might have been suffering from battered woman syndrome, a condition that can distort perception and spur extreme responses. Although Nancy never took the stand during trial, statements she made to mental health professionals were read aloud, detailing her alleged terror on the night in question. The defense's approach aimed to sow enough doubt in the jury's mind about Nancy's intentions, or at least about the clarity of her thinking, to avoid a murder conviction. Yet the prosecution's counter-arguments proved formidable. They called former neighbors and friends of the couple, few of whom could corroborate Nancy's depiction of Robert as an abuser. Several testified that Robert displayed no signs of aggressive or coercive behavior. Photographs of social events and family trips revealed what appeared to be a supportive husband interacting affectionately with his wife. Moreover, the painstaking forensic evidence of how the murder unfolded, particularly the sedation factor, strongly suggested a planned act rather than an impulsive one. In cross-examination, the prosecution pressed the defense's psychological experts to admit that no formal diagnosis of battered woman syndrome had been applied to Nancy prior to Robert's death. And the prosecution suggested that the prosecution did not identify witnesses in the row, and the jury deliberated for hours, sifting through the complexities. In the end, the evidence of methodical planning weighed heavily. Nancy was found guilty of murder. The verdict reverberated through Hong Kong, sending a clear message about the seriousness with which the city's legal system treats premeditated homicide. So, when she received a mandatory life sentence, a punishment that underscored the gravity of the crime and the court's rejection of her claims of either self-defense or diminished responsibility. During her trial, the defense lawyers include news of Nancy's conviction reverberated through Parkview, the expatriate community, and Hong Kong at large. Some residents were relieved that justice had been served. Others remained shaken to the core that such brutality could emerge from a seemingly stable marriage in one of the city's most secure environments. The Kissel children were taken under the care of relatives, spared from the media glare as best as possible, and indeed, the family tragedy extended to them most of all, for they had lost a father and were effectively losing a mother as well. In the days immediately following the verdict, the community around Parkview grappled with profound shock. Families who had socialized with the Kissels found themselves questioning whether they had ever really known their neighbors. Rumors circulated about how the children were coping, but official statements remained private. Local news outlets ran opinion pieces examining the psychological toll of the high-pressure expatriate lifestyle. Some commentators pointed to this case as a stark reminder of how unaddressed mental health issues can metastasize in environments that prize social status and outward appearances above all else. And so this piece kind of goes on to give Robert's extended family, devastated by the loss, initiated a legal process to secure custody of the children, ensuring they would be raised in a supportive environment. Colleagues of Robert set up a memorial fund in his name, donating to charities focused on domestic violence prevention and mental health awareness in Asia. Though Robert had never been publicly linked to philanthropic work of that nature, his family believed that channeling public attention toward these causes was a fitting tribute given the circumstances. Long after the immediate swirl of the trial subsided, the Kissel case remained etched into the public consciousness. For Hong Kong's expatriate community, it punctured the illusion that wealth and privilege guarantee safety or happiness. Conversations about the case prompted more open dialogues about marital strife, mental health concerns, and the potential hidden turmoils that can exist behind closed doors. At some level, it influenced families to be more vigilant about their friends and neighbors who might be silently struggling. On a broader scale, the case spurred reflections within the local judicial system regarding how claims of domestic abuse and mental health are treated in homicide cases. Nancy appealed her conviction multiple times, and in one instance, her conviction was briefly overturned before being reinstated on retrial. Source: Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal 2010. Legal experts debated whether battered woman syndrome or potential mental health defenses were thoroughly examined, suggesting that more nuanced approaches to psychological evidence might be warranted in future proceedings. The case thus became something of a benchmark for how the legal system balances forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and psychological defenses. Historically, the Kissel trial stands as one of Hong Kong's most sensational murder cases, rivaling other high-profile homicides that intermittently shake the city. Journalists and criminologists often cite it as a cautionary tale about the destructive power of unresolved conflicts within marriage. Quote, beyond legal precedents, it has entered the collective memory as a testament to the unsettling truth that the line between domestic normalcy and violence can be alarmingly thin when mental health, relationship breakdowns, and high-stress lifestyles converge. Years later, public discussions would sometimes return to the images of Nancy Kissel wheeling that heavy carpet through the hallways of Parkview, trying to hide the evidence of what she had done. Those images remain seared into the city's consciousness, a grim reminder that illusions can evaporate in an instant, revealing horrors no one thought possible in such a privileged enclave. Family friends who still think of Robert describe him as a hardworking, kind man who didn't deserve such a fate. Whether Nancy's actions were fueled by a genuine mental break or a calculated plan may never be fully settled in the court of public opinion. What is certain is that the legacy of that night remains long after the final gavel fell, embedded in the city's lore as one of its darkest chapters. Over the course of the entire criminal process, several key points emerged as crucial to understanding the depth and significance of this case. The marriage that once seemed promising grew toxic, possibly from mutual neglect or deeper issues known only to Nancy and Robert. Forensic experts traced the events of that November night through methodical study of sedatives, blood spatter, and the suspicious milkshake. This scientific precision left little doubt about the brutality of the murder and the improbability of a self-defense claim. The trial unfolded as a tense showdown between prosecutors wielding damning physical evidence and defenders spotlighting unverified allegations of abuse. Ultimately, the court's decision hinged on the glaring disparity between Nancy's narrative and the grim forensics pointing to a planned killing. Nancy's attribution, however, found a bias, the overarching narrative pointing to a planned killing. Throughout the process, the case captured global headlines, fueling debates about the pressures of expatriate life, the complexities of spousal homicide, and the reliability of mental health defenses. Though overshadowed by the sensational aspects of the Milkshake murder, the story stands as a sobering reminder that no facade, however polished, is immune to hidden rifts. The court's verdict, sentencing Nancy Kissel to life imprisonment, served as a final declaration that her actions merited the most severe legal consequence Hong Kong could impose. The further sentencing Nancy Kissel to Hong Kong could impose. The Kissel murder had lasting legal, social, and emotional effects. Legally, it underscored the stringent standards Hong Kong places on homicide prosecutions, particularly when the defense invokes potential psychological distress. Some women's advocacy groups argued that if Nancy had indeed suffered abuse, the courts should have been more receptive. But the Court of Appeals ultimately found insufficient evidence to support her claims. Socially, the case planted seeds for deeper conversations about mental health. Resources, particularly for expatriates living abroad under extreme stress. Several community organizations and volunteer groups began offering counseling and support services specifically tailored for foreign residents in high-pressure environments. End quote. In the longer view, the case became emblematic of the hidden dysfunctions that can lurk in domestic settings. It served as a catalyst for policy discussions around mental health screening, family counseling, and more robust legal frameworks for addressing domestic violence allegations. While Nancy's appeals extended the legal drama, they did little to quell the broader sense of tragedy that enveloped the entire affair. For many, the main takeaway was heartbreak for the three Kissel children, who were forever caught between the memory of their father's death and their mother's incarceration. Historians of modern Hong Kong may well continue to cite the Kissel murder as a turning point in the public's acknowledgement that affluence alone offers no inoculation against domestic tragedy. As this narrative draws to a close, several themes resonate. The case's timeline, beginning with the couple's hopeful relocation to Hong Kong and culminating in the savage murder, suggests how internal pressures can mount silently until they rupture in unspeakable acts. The critical evidence, most notably the sedative-laced milkshake, became the linchpin of the prosecution's argument, providing a window into the premeditative nature of the crime. Key turning points included Robert's discovery of potential financial or emotional betrayals, and Nancy's relentless progression from a distressed spouse to a convicted murderer. In the end, the investigation breakthroughs hinged on thorough forensic methods and the damning physical evidence that unraveled any pretense of a simple domestic accident. What remains in the collective memory is the chilling lesson that no one is exempt from tragedy. If a well-resourced, seemingly stable family living in a premier enclave can descend into deadly violence, it speaks to the fragility of domestic life when deeper issues go unaddressed. Beyond the sensational headlines, the Kissel murder compelled authorities and citizens alike to reevaluate policies around mental health and domestic conflicts. It also contributed to the ongoing discourse on how legal frameworks handle accusations of abuse, mental illness, and premeditation in homicide cases, an ongoing conversation that resonates in many jurisdictions around the world. For those who study law, psychology, or criminology, the case remains a revealing example of how a single piece of evidence, the tainted milkshake, can become the fulcrum upon which an entire murder charge turns. For the broader public, it stands as a stark cautionary tale about the dangers of letting resentment and despair fester behind a polished front. Ultimately, the story's key lesson is that vigilance, empathy, and proactive support systems are essential in any community, whether in Hong Kong's glittering towers or elsewhere. If there is to be a call to action, it might be found in the imperative to remain attuned to the subtle indicators of domestic turmoil among our friends, neighbors, and loved ones. Early intervention through counseling, dialogue, or even legal avenues can sometimes avert catastrophe. By learning from such tragedies, society can strive to provide resources that may help individuals like Nancy Kissel seek help long before their desperation morphs into violence. One cannot simply assume that outward success equates to an inwardly stable life. True well-being often requires active support, understanding, and sometimes professional intervention. In considering this sobering account, it helps to ask ourselves what might have changed if more people in the Kissel's circle had probed deeper into the couple's struggles. Could an open, non judgmental conversation have led to therapy rather than murder? There is no way to rewrite a tragedy that has already unfolded. But raising such questions may pave the way for community based efforts that encourage people to speak out about domestic conflicts and mental health challenges. Doing so fosters an environment where prevention is not just a theoretical possibility, but a lived reality. Um, this case continues to spark debate among those who analyze its layers. Was justice served, or did certain nuances go unaddressed? Did the legal system strike the correct balance between objectivity and compassion? Or did it undervalue possible emotional and psychological torment on Nancy's part? How might future cases involve different approaches to battered woman syndrome claims or mental health defenses? Disclaimer: I spoke to professionals on this subject and wasn't turned off. The conversation remains open ended, inviting professionals and lay people alike to share their perspectives on this complex, unsettling tragedy. In the aftermath of reading about cases like these, one cannot help but wonder how to spot warning signs in our own communities and relationships. Mental health professionals have pointed to the importance of recognizing shifts in mood, changes in behavior, and sudden disconnections from social networks as potential harbingers of deeper distress. If you or someone you know experiences such turmoil, it's crucial to seek professional help or, at the very least, confide in a trusted friend, colleague, or family member. The tragedy of Robert Kissel's murder underscores how quickly situations can escalate to irreversible ends when problems remain hidden in the shadows. If Feel free to share your thoughts or engage in a community-based dialogue about the lessons this case presents. Have you ever encountered signs of hidden turmoil in friends or family that, in hindsight, seemed more serious? What community resources might be expanded to support families under the intense stresses of professional life? The conversation around prevention and open communication could very well be the key to ensuring that such a tragic scenario does not repeat itself in another unsuspecting home.